thank you for joining me, Lara Quie, for the Legal Genie podcast. As a former corporate lawyer and APAC head of business development for an international law firm, my mission with this podcast is to provide you with insights into the careers and lives of movers and shakers in the legal industry. Mentors are hard to come by, so by listening to these conversations, I hope that you will gain some valuable insights that will help you move forward in your career and personal life. I ask my guests to share their advice and experience with you. I ask them also to share about their mindset. As an executive coach, I work one-on-one with lawyers to grow their practice and self-confidence. I also run mastermind groups and business development accelerators designed to bring like-minded people together to learn, grow, and support each other. If you would like to learn more, please connect with me on LinkedIn or through my website. The details are in the show notes. Please rate and review the Legal Genie podcast to help us reach more people who may find it helpful. So let's move on to this week's episode. I hope that you enjoy the conversation. Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Legal Genie podcast with me, your host, Lara Quie. Today I'm delighted to have with me Stanley T. Stanley is a prolific speaker and networker, and in fact, I would say that he is the networking king of Singapore. Stanley is Managing Director and Head of Legal for Asia Pacific for Scotiabank's Global Banking and Markets Division. He's based in Singapore and is responsible for all legal matters across the region. Stanley started his legal career as a law clerk before joining Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen Hamilton, and later Coudert Brothers in New York. He then moved in-house at Salomon Barney and UBS Securities in Tokyo. He then joined DKR Oasis as Chief Compliance Officer in Hong Kong before moving back to Tokyo in 2009 for a role with Barclays Global Investors as General Counsel. In 2011, he moved to Daiwa Capital Markets as Senior Legal Counsel in Hong Kong before transferring internally to Singapore. In 2014, Stanley joined Scotiabank in Singapore, where he has been ever since. Stanley graduated from Princeton University with a degree in economics and received his law degree from Harvard Law School. He was also a Fulbright Scholar at Stockholm University in Sweden. He's a keen long-distance runner and pet lover, and he's also a foodie and enjoys hosting parties with his Japanese wife, Shino. Stanley, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you, Lara. I'm flattered to be here and looking forward to my interview with you.
Thanks very much. It's always good to start right at the beginning. And I know that you've got a really fascinating and international background as a third culture kid. So tell me a little bit about where you grew up and your family.
Sure. My father's Korean and my mother is Japanese. They were both pioneers of sorts because they were two of very few immigrants to the United States in the late 1950s, especially given their backgrounds. In those days, as few as the Asian immigrants were, they generally came from the very elite strata of society on special government scholarships or programs or very kind of privileged positions for the very few. But my parents were nothing like that. They didn't have that kind of background at all. In fact, neither of them finished high school. And so they came over just by the sheer scrappiness of their desire to make it to the United States and make a life for themselves. They immigrated here as college students, and I was born, therefore, in the U.S. I was born in Missouri, but then when I was 3, moved to Wisconsin. I grew up for most of my early formative years in Wisconsin, where I was, for the most part of my life, and in most of the schools and other places where I frequented, I was the only Asian kid. In fact, I was the only minority kid at all. I lived in a small suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lived there until I was 12. And then my father, who was in academia, took a job in Germany. He was teaching for Boston University in a program for military personnel during the early 1970s. And so we picked up sticks and we moved to Germany for a year. I thought it was a great opportunity to do something a little bit different. I guess even when I was only 12, I still had that urge to be a little bit adventurous and try something different from the ordinary course. And so I broke out of the normal sort of educational track for international kids in Germany. And I went to a German school without knowing a word of German. And then by the end of the year, I was taking tests in German and even acing a few of them. That was quite an adventure. We came back after a year, though, came back to Wisconsin for a few years, at which time my father ended his career in academia and he joined the UN. So we moved to Lebanon. We went from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Beirut, Lebanon. This is in 1978, right after the Civil War. And my father joined the United Nations in Beirut. I thought it was quite a dramatic change. In many ways, I thought it was quite exciting. But after the end of my sophomore year of high school, I, mostly because I was a rebellious kind of teenager, not sure what to do with all his pent-up frustrations with life and his anger at the world, I dropped out of high school. And in fact, I tried to run away from home, but there was nowhere to go in Beirut. So I came back after 30 minutes of running away from home. And after a lot of storm and fury, my parents and I decided that they would ship me off to my uncle, my mother's brother, in Nagoya, Japan, where I spent a year in the wilderness, so to speak, being a waiter at my uncle's Greek restaurant in Nagoya, Japan, not speaking a word of Japanese, but looking like I speak Japanese and pretending to speak Japanese and picking up a few words of Greek in between. Most of it was cuisine related, but that's what I did for a year. And I taught Japanese actually also on the side, illegally, because I was 16 and I wasn't supposed to work until I was 18. But most of the schools there didn't really care because they had a native speaker on their hands. And so I did that for a year, but eventually came back to my senses and came back to Beirut. But after some more kind of storm and fury, my parents and I decided that they would ship me for my second to last year of high school back to Germany, back to the same town where I lived in when I was 12. And then, but this time I went by myself and I attended the American high school on the military base in Würzburg. Finished my junior year of high school there. At that time, my father decided to leave the UN in Beirut and transferred to Vienna, Austria. I rejoined my family for my last year of high school in Vienna. I graduated from the American International School in Vienna and then went to Princeton from there. That's a little bit about my background growing up from Princeton. I think you've already summarized some of my main, modules of my life or parts of my life since then, but that was my childhood and growing up period, Lara.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. Stanley, what contrasts you mentioned being in the US, being in Germany, Lebanon, Japan, Austria, so many places. Obviously, you're here now in Singapore. You've worked in Hong Kong and Tokyo, and such an international background. And I know that you're also a linguist. On your LinkedIn, you've listed 6 languages, which is incredible. Have your languages played a role in your life?
Yes, I wish I could say, honestly speaking, I wish I could say I speak 6 languages, but sometimes I wonder whether I can even speak one. But I guess I can speak one, and the others maybe I do a little bit more than dabble in, but not much more. So I'm quick to point out that perhaps it's more accurate to say I try my best to dabble in these languages. But I'd say that languages, to the extent I've been fortunate enough or privileged enough to really learn them, either by living in countries that speak those languages or that embrace those languages. For example, Lebanon doesn't speak French as a native language, but they embrace French because it was a French colony. And when I was living in New York, 25% of the population in New York speaks Spanish as a first language. And also, when I took a year off and traveled and backpacked, I spent a good part of it in Latin America, just speaking Spanish every day. Spent a year in Sweden and had a Swedish fiance, and Japan 10 years. So I've just had a privilege. And I'd say that the real kind of benefit of learning languages was that it really forced me more than anyone else to really steep myself in the country of that language. Language is a window to the culture, the people, the values, the ways of communicating, the history of any country. And to the extent that you can learn even a little bit of any language, I think it really gives you a much greater feeling, if nothing else, for who that country is and what is important in that country. And not to mention the value of being able to speak that country when you meet people from that country, even if you can't speak it perfectly. And even if you can't speak it well, the evidence that speaking a language provides of interest in a country or in a people is invaluable in my experience in building bridges to people from that country or even from that region, or even people who have an interest in that country when they're not from that country. So it really has created opportunities and access for me to many nations and cultures and peoples and experiences that I never otherwise would have had.
Yes, I absolutely agree. It gives us great insights into the culture and psychology of a nation. So it's really a great thing to be able to speak to the local people and understand where they're coming from and their worldview. Certainly language shapes their worldview to some degree. So having those insights and abilities is wonderful. And I certainly share a love of languages and integration in the same way. So you studied economics at Princeton, so not law at that stage. So I'm wondering about your legal career since and wondering what inspired you to take law at Harvard Law in the first place.
Sure. When I was I'd say a sophomore in college, around my second year of college, I had decided upon law already for two reasons. One, but probably not the main reason, but one reason was I wanted to be a politician. And I looked around me, and in my ambitious sort of wonderings, I looked around me and saw that most of the politicians, or many politicians, were lawyers by background in Congress or even presidents and other kind of in the United States as well as other countries. And so I thought that would be a great springboard for a career in politics. Now, I have since disabused myself of any sort of pretensions to those kind of aspirations, but that at that time, that was one of my motivations. But the more important and more lasting kind of motivation, which still applies today, is it was a happy medium between two important, I guess, characteristics of anything I wanted in my life and what I wanted to see in my livelihood, in my career, in my profession. First, I wanted a profession or a livelihood or a job that was intellectual. I grew up in an intellectual home. My father was in academia. He was a professor. And even after he moved to the UN, his job was basically economic research for the UN organizations he worked for. And so I was just almost by osmosis. I was immersed in an environment of books and studying and conceptual mastery of subjects and scholarly understanding. And it became almost second nature. My father's friends also were professors or people who were involved in academics or who were highly educated. My mother also had a master's degree. And so I grew up in an academic environment almost with the presumption that I would do something that is academic. And so that was one important criterion for me in selecting what I wanted to do as a career. But when I looked at my father, especially by the time I got to university, I didn't really want to do what he did. I saw him as living a life in an ivory tower, rather isolated and separated from the real world and real people and real problems. He basically did research. And from time to time, he would go to classes and lord it over eager young minds, not necessarily interested in hearing what he had to say about getting a grade and moving on and graduating. But in any case, he would teach from time to time. But the real ladder to success in academia is publishing. He would just devote his entire life energies to just doing research and creating these castles in the sky that no one really cared about and really didn't have much relevance to real world problems. That's not for me. So I want something that's intellectual. It's not even something I really wanted. It's something I just assumed or that I grew up with, but I did ultimately want something intellectual or needed something intellectual. And then on the other hand, I wanted something that was practical, that was worldly, that was relevant to real people, real problems, and dealing with real situations. So I needed something that was really a combination of the two. That law fit that bill pretty well, at least conceptually. When I was in college, I had no idea what it was like to practice law, but I thought, well, if you're a lawyer, basically you're involved in something, in a profession that has some sort of intellectual discipline, it has some sort of intellectual rigor. It has a backbone because all of the arguments and analysis and kind of decisions and advice, they're all linked to an underlying law or basic concepts. There is some intellectual rigor to it. And yet at the same time, lawyers, for the most part, were called upon to deal with real problems. Now, to be sure, they deal with all kinds of different problems, and different lawyers deal with different kinds of problems, but they are solving problems and dealing with people and dealing with real issues. They apply their intellect and their intellect to real problems, and they get out there and they mix it up in the world. So that's why I chose the law. And I'm happy to say that 30 plus years after graduating and 30 plus years after beginning to use my law degree in practice, I still think that the law satisfies me. Those two criteria in particular. And that's why I continue to be a lawyer. I have at times had an opportunity or opportunities to do other things, not in the legal profession. And I know of many people who have made that jump. Certainly, if I put my mind to it, I could have increased my chances of leaving the law. But I never wanted to. I never wanted to into this day.
That's a great insight into your inspiration for going into law. And certainly, yes, it has great intellectual rigor, exactly as you say. And it's so pleasing to hear how after 30 years, you still find it an extremely satisfying career. So looking at your initial venture into law, you were a law clerk. Tell us a bit about that experience and what you thought at that stage would be your legal career.
Sure. I guess I did it for three reasons. One, I thought it would look great on my resume. I was this young kid who could think nothing else except building up his resume, get a clerkship. Now I look back, it's foolish to be even preoccupied with kind of building a resume, but certainly it's understandable for any young kind of professional who's just starting out. But the second reason was I thought it was good training for a career as a litigator. I'll get to know the courts. And I thought, when I be a lawyer, I definitely want to be a litigator because that's the essence or the quintessential sort of calling of a lawyer is to be a litigator and argue like Perry Mason in front of the courts. And that's what I want to be. I was dead set I want to be a litigator. Certain I was going to be a litigator. The third reason was that I thought it would be a form of public service, that I could do something in the public interest and yet at the same time addressing other desires or needs that I wanted. I could be a limited stint working for the federal courts, and I could apply my mind to helping judges make the right decisions. I guess there was a fourth reason too, and the fourth reason was that this was a real opportunity. I'd see a real privilege to work with very distinguished people in the legal career and generally people whom I otherwise perhaps would not have had such privileged access to on such an intimate and meaningful basis for the rest of my life. And it's probably true. My first judge, Robert Carter, who was district court judge in the Southern District of New York, he was, together with Thurgood Marshall, legal counsel for Brown in Brown versus Board of Education. So he was at the NAACP at that time, and he and Thurgood Marshall represented Brown. And so he was a historic figure in certain circles, civil rights circles within the U.S. in particular. So that was really his wisdom and his kind of understanding it was almost uncanny, but it was a real privilege. And then Bruce Selya was on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, a brilliant guy, also Harvard Law alum. And now I think he's taken senior status, but also a very worthwhile experience, amazing, kind of very privileged experience in and of itself, apart from anything else. So I think that was the fourth reason, just the opportunity to really work closely with two very distinguished lawyers/judges.
So at that point in time, having gained that insight into litigation, were you still set on being a litigation lawyer?
Yes, until I got my first assignment. But yes, I was. I thought I was going to be Perry Mason or do something like Perry Mason did.
So you went to Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton, a white shoe law firm in New York, and you were an associate there. Is that where you did your training as well?
Yes. But before I went, I took 2 years off after my clerkship. And one of the reasons I took 2 years off was to make up for lost time. One of the biggest mistakes in my entire life to this day is between college and law school, I didn't take any time off. And I tell my kids today, and I tell everyone I get a chance to tell this to, I say, don't do that. Don't make the same mistake I did. There's no rush. Take a couple years off, go do something really exotic and fun and interesting, and go work for the Peace Corps in the Congo, or go spend a couple of years in Latin America, in Brazil, or spend a year in Laos and teach kids English, or do something really crazy and exciting and something that would be enriching to your life and not just speed up your career. There's no rush. And I didn't do that. I didn't heed my own words. And so I realized that afterwards, and I was trying to make up for lost time. And so that was one of the reasons I did my Fulbright after my second clerkship. I didn't go straight into law. So I went off to Sweden to study for a year, in part because I was trying to make up for lost time for a mistake I had made in previously and not taking some time off. I'd spent about 4 years on the continent in Europe prior to going to law school. If you add up all the time that I was in Vienna and in Germany. And during those times, I traveled extensively with my family and otherwise throughout Southern Europe and even Central Europe. But I'd never set foot in Northern Europe. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, never. And I thought, I'm going to take some time off, got a full year. Oh, and by the way, there's a Fulbright program that seems to fit exactly into my plans, into my desires. There's a program that Fulbright is offering at the University of Stockholm for a year. Foreign lawyers, a better match couldn't have been made in heaven. It was perfectly crafted for what I'm doing. I wanted to spend a year in Northern Europe just having fun and experiencing life in Northern Europe and meeting people and seeing a part of Europe I've never seen before in a relaxed and fun sort of way. And so that fit the bill perfectly. And so I applied with gusto to the Fulbright Association during my second year, my second clerkship. And fortunately, I was able to get in. So I went to Sweden for that reason, really to see Northern Europe. That was the reason I did my Fulbright. It wasn't to pad my resume. It wasn't to study Swedish law. It wasn't to become engaged to a Swedish woman, which I did. It wasn't to make a lot of friends that would continue to this day to be my friends. It wasn't to learn Swedish. It wasn't to go and meet law students from all the different countries. And I went to Iceland and to Finland and Norway, and because I got involved with the law students at the University of Stockholm. And we went to Denmark also and had a fantastic time. It was fabulous and learned about Swedish food. And it was great. The classmates of mine were from all over the world. The Swedish students I met were some of the most interesting people. And I was fortunate enough to become engaged to a Swedish woman too. It didn't work out. We never got married. We were engaged for a couple of years, but it was a wonderful experience and gave me real access to Swedish life and families and culture and really enhanced my Swedish experience. And I'm in touch with Maria to this day. And it was a remarkable experience. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to take another year off before I started working. And so I realized at the end of my year in Sweden, I realized, oh my God, I had interviewed already with Cleary at the end of my second clerkship and already had a position at Cleary at the end of my second year of clerking. I was supposed to start, and they knew about my Fulbright when I was interviewing because I already had my Fulbright when I was accepting their offer. And so after I had my Fulbright, I was scheduled to start at Cleary as if my Fulbright were my last year of law school, because typically in the U.S., law students interview the first semester of their second year. And so I had analogized my situation to being a second-year student in law school and said that my next year was already spoken for, and I was going to be in Sweden on a Fulbright, and so that I was going to be available to Cleary during the summer of the year after I was interviewing. But when the time came, when I graduated, I thought, I'm going to be working a gazillion hours a year and going to be dedicated to my profession and going to have no time really to do much else significant. And I realized at that time that in spite of all the travels that I had done in the different places I'd lived, I had never, ever even set foot in the 3 biggest countries in the world in terms of landmass and population. I had never been to the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union at that time. Never. This is 1990. I had never been to China. I had never been to India. Those 3 populations covered more than half the world's populations right then and there. Just those 3 countries. And I also realized even though I'd grown up in the United States and I'd gone to finished my higher education in the United States, spent decades in the US, I had never set foot in Mexico or in Central America or South America. And I thought it was a shame. Here I was, 30 years old, about to start a career that would last me for who knows how long. And I wouldn't have time to really meaningfully travel and see all these countries and peoples and in these hugely important places or countries, geographies in the world. More than half the world's population lived in these countries, more if you add Latin America. And I never even set foot in them. I had no clue how these people lived. And this is before the era of internet and YouTube. And I didn't even know what life looked like. I could only imagine. And that wasn't good enough. I said, I've got to do this. I've got to take a year off. I got to go see these places by hook or by crook. I've got to get there. Even though it was difficult, the Soviet Union was going through coups and putsches, and the communists were being kicked out. And then it was right after Gorbachev, they were being kicked out of power. And then they did a coup and came back to power. And Yeltsin was on top of the tanks waving a white flag. There was all sorts of turmoil. And so I said, I don't care. I've got to get there. And I've got it because this is my last chance. And then I didn't know anyone in the Soviet Union. So I spent part of my year in Sweden making contacts and establishing relationships with people who live in the Soviet Union, because that was the only way I could get there. You couldn't really stay in hotels. It was possible, but it was just outrageously expensive because they would basically extort tourists for huge amounts of money. And so I made all the preparations for that. And then China at the time in 1990 was a very different situation as well. So was India and then Latin America, but I just had to do it. I saved up some money. I arranged with Cleary to just put off my start date a little bit further and to let me spend a little bit more time and maybe start in May of 1992 instead of December 1991. And then I arranged to work as a summer associate in Brussels after my year in Sweden, saved some money from my summer associate time, several $1,000s. And then I slowly accumulated credit limits on my credit cards at that time. And it was very difficult because as a student, no one would give you a credit limit. I had no salary, but somehow I was able to get student credit cards, and I would increase my limit slowly from $500 to $1,000. I think by the time I had graduated from my program in Sweden, I had accumulated a few $1,000s on each of 2 or 3 credit cards lined up, and I had my savings for Cleary, and then I was going to live on a shoestring for 9 or 10 months, and just did it. After my summer associate stint at Cleary's in Brussels, September 1, I got on a plane in Frankfurt and landed in Moscow, and I traveled for the next 9 months in Soviet Union, took the Trans-Siberian to China, Soviet Union for about 5 weeks, China for about 6 weeks, India for about 5 weeks, where I met Mother Teresa in Calcutta. I walked into Calcutta and isn't Mother Teresa supposed to be here? Eventually I found out, oh yeah, in fact, she's in town and she's giving Vespers at 5:30 in the morning. Made a beeline to Mother Teresa's convent at 5:30 in the morning. There she was. There were hundreds of people around her, but right afterwards I went straight for her and asked her for her autograph. Then I spent that whole day at one of her hospices cleaning bed sheets. So I was there, and then I came back to the U.S., met my family, and then I started the second leg of my trip. And I started in Mexico, and I went south, overland, as much as possible, either by foot, by hitchhiking, by bus. I went from Mexico, just went all the way through, first to Guatemala, and then the next was Nicaragua, I think was the next country, and then Honduras, and then went to Costa Rica, and then Panama, and where I stayed with a Sandinista in Nicaragua. The only reason they let me in was because they didn't think I was American. They thought I was Japanese. And so they let me stay at their home for a night. And then I went from Panama. You can't cross into Colombia at the Panama-Colombian Gap. It's impassable, even to this day. So I flew to Brazil. I started my South American trip. Went through every country except the 3 Guianas at the top of Brazil. Yeah, I took another year off, came back just like the weekend before I was supposed to start at Cleary, from Venezuela, from Caracas, and started Cleary the following Monday. So there was a little bit that happened between the end of my clerkship and Cleary. and it was important for me. That was one of the most important parts of my life. Those 2 years were hugely important. So I can't thank my lecturers enough for somehow making it possible for me to do not only my scholarship in Stockholm, and for everything I was fortunate enough to be able to see and do and experience in Stockholm, and friends I've made, including my ex-fiancée. And to my trip, it was just, I don't know, when I look back, I think, oh, it's unbelievable. The stars were aligned, and I wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world. Those 2 years were 2 of the most kind of valuable years of my experience looking back.
Wow, your passion for travel and your incredible curiosity to see other places, other experience, other cultures, etc., and to step out of the well-trodden path. So people generally go to university, go straight to law school, go straight into their first training position and their job. And you were still free and living the life at age 30. As someone who thought that I had taken the long path to qualify at 26, I can see that actually I shouldn't have worried when I compare myself to the path that you took. But isn't it amazing how your insights and your true global citizen approach has led to such an international career? So what do you think about those those learnings, how has that shaped your mindset to the person that you are today?
It's made me more open-minded. Just no country, no people, no government, nobody has a monopoly on what is right or the best way to do things. Or I think that's the biggest takeaway. And I think that's affected me in many different ways. And just to see those people, you see so much, and you realize that the life I had been living was so small. Yeah, I think that really, it's emotional now, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing the insights that you had, that ability to be so driven.
It gave me a better perspective. What I always tell my kids, and I really want them to take time, and I feel so strongly that those 2 years were so the time when I went straight to law school from college. I didn't realize that because I thought, I've got to be on this track and I've got to get ahead. And I thought I knew what I needed to do and what was right. And I guess more than anything else, I realized, it just made me more open-minded, made me realize how small my world was. And that has affected everything subsequently too. Ultimately, you have to be practical as well. And so you have to reconcile kind of practical necessity with broader kind of desires or objectives or even feelings. The other thing, Lara, is I think it's made me feel comfortable dealing with or meeting and interacting with and engaging people from anywhere. And it's also enabled me to embrace people from anywhere. Not only people, but people in situations and possibility, opportunities, problems. It's not to say I'm comfortable with anything, but it certainly made me more comfortable and more willing and more, I think, perhaps more able to meet and embrace and to open myself up to people from all different walks of life. Not only different nationalities, but especially nationalities, but also people from different backgrounds and regardless of nationality. I guess in a couple of ways. First, my experience in dealing with all these kind of situations mostly has given me some assurance that we're dealing with kind of unexpected or various situations going forward. But so I think more than anything else, that has been the biggest takeaway.
And it sounds like your path was quite non-traditional in many ways. And so if you think about young people today and, the virtual world that they're living in because of the pandemic, what advice would you give them given the current situation? What do you think that they should do right now if they were, say, either law school stage or trainee stage?
I would say that the biggest pitfall I faced when I was growing up was two things. First, let me think. Yeah, two things. I would tend to, at different points in my life, I would fall into the trap of feeling sorry for myself. So if something wouldn't work out right, or I'd have a problem, or it didn't quite go the way I wanted, or I was having more difficult than I expected, or whatever may have come up, I would feel sorry for myself. And that set me back, I think, more than anything else. And what was really helpful for me in those situations was to really take stock of everything I had to be thankful for and all the privileges and opportunity that I was given, and to focus on, to really be positive rather than negative. My mother used to always say to me when I was growing up, among others, "Oh, count your blessings, Stanley, count your blessings." Oh, yeah. You told me that a million times. I'm tired of hearing that from you. Be thankful for what you have. Be grateful. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Mom. I've got a life to live. But as I look back, the older I grew, and I guess the more I learned about myself more than anyone else, the more those words really resonated with me. So I would encourage young professionals to realize how lucky they are and how much they have, and to embrace the opportunities and the chances and their abilities, and to make the most of everything that they have, rather than sulking or being angry or feeling sorry for yourself. Carpe diem, as Robin Williams is known to have said. And so that's the second, has more to, I think, with not so much with career success, although I think it would lead to career success, but it has more to do with kind of my own sort of satisfaction with my life and my own happiness, if you will. Not to become too philosophical. When I was growing up and going to school, I was always told to make plans. Oh, I shouldn't say always, but oftentimes I would hear that I should make plans, set goals and deadlines and milestones and even my relatives sometimes would say, oh, Stanley, in order to be successful, you've got to create milestones for yourself. You've got to have plans for yourself. You've got to be a certain place by a certain age, and you've got to accomplish this much by this time. And you've got to really plan, Stanley. Plan your life. You want to be successful, this is what you do. And so to some extent, I just absorbed that. I thought I had to do just that, make plans about what I would do next and what the next stage of my life was going to be and what I had to do to get where and where I was supposed to be by certain and so forth. And that had, I guess that was one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made in my entire life. And it really hurt me. It really hurt me. I look back. Now I'm almost 60. And I look back, and if I could change one thing in my life, it would probably be that. It probably would be that. Making plans isn't so bad in and of itself. But let me speak for myself. It wasn't so much just making the plans, but it was the fact that I took my plans so seriously. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why it was one of the biggest mistakes. It was the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. I'll tell you why. For two reasons. There were two reasons why it's the biggest mistake in my life. And it was what I would change. So one thing, if I could change one thing in my life, it would be that. And I'll tell you why. First, and perhaps foremost, during my youth, maybe when I was in my educational period, starting from my time at Princeton and even before that, and then during my career, every step of the way, during my clerkships, even during my time at Sweden, during my stint at Cleary, during my 5 years at Coudert, even during my years in-house, even during the time when I was in Japan, but especially during those kind of formative years of my career, I was so fixated on my plan and where I was supposed to be and where I was trying to be a partner at Cleary or Coudert or get a Supreme Court clerkship or graduate number one in my class, wherever it is, or do this or that, or become General Counsel. I was so fixated on my plan that I almost totally missed the wonderful experiences I was going through. I failed to smell the roses along the way. And I look back and I say, wow, either by other people's estimation or by own estimation, I think, what a fantastically privileged life you had. You went to Princeton, you went to Harvard Law, you were gathered together with some of the most brilliant minds in the world. You had some of the most fascinating, interesting classmates and all sorts of other privileges. You lived in these countries, in Lebanon, you were in Sweden, you lived in Japan, you worked at Cleary, Gottlieb, again, some of the most greatest lawyers and most interesting deals, worked at Coudert with equally diverse, really interesting lawyers and amazing people. And you've done all that, but when you were doing it, you didn't really appreciate it or enjoy it or really smell the roses while you were doing it. So it's nothing more than an item on your CV. That's all it is. And here I'm 60 years old. And I look back and I don't have anything to show for it other than a line item on my CV. Yeah, I graduated summa from Princeton, or was it Harvard? I was on Harvard Law Review at the Harvard Law School. Or I worked at Cleary Gottlieb on all these billion-dollar deals. But actually, in true fact, Lara, in terms of true experience and enjoying this experience, I didn't. I missed it. I missed it all because I was too fixated on getting where I was supposed to be and looking at where I was going to be next instead of enjoying where I was then and there. And that was the biggest mistake I've made in my whole life. And now there's nothing I can do about it because those experiences, as impressive as they sound and as marvelous as those experiences seem, they weren't for me. They weren't marvelous. They weren't wonderful. Or that makes it sound silly. They weren't as wonderful and as marvelous as they could have been if I had just smelled the roses while I was going through. And that was the biggest mistake I've ever made. And the reason I did that was because my entire life, even going back to my high school years when I was in Lebanon, or through my entire life, is because I was fixated on my plans. I had these plans that everyone, from my parents to my relatives to even society, was telling me I had to do in order to be a success. What does success mean? I'm looking back, I'm 6 years old. Success was, but that robbed me, that mindset, that kind of narrow-mindedness, those blinkers prevented me from it. It doesn't really matter whether I'd gone to Princeton or Harvard or did a Fulbright in Stockholm or was as marvelous as, or worked at Cleary. Those are real privileges, of course, and I take that. But I would trade those items on my CV any day for experiences at less marvelous, quote unquote, institutions or places, less marvelous opportunities, if I only could have appreciated whatever I was going through. Because I would trade any day. I would trade 4 years at Princeton, what I went through, my 4 years at Princeton. This is not a knock against Princeton, it's a knock against me. For 4 years at a lesser institution, less one institution. Yeah. Oh, Stanley, this has been fabulous. You were classmates with Michelle Obama, and you went to Princeton, all these brilliant people, and or whoever you were, same kind of walked campus with Jeff Bezos, Brooke Shields, and so none of that. Or Princeton itself, and they weren't, all of my classmates were equally, everyone has their own story and their own stories to share. And I would trade it any day in a heartbeat. If I would trade my experience there for another chance to go through that experience at a lesser institution, if I could only have a different mindset while I was going through it. If I only knew then what I knew now, I would trade anything I've been through. Anything. Yeah. And the second reason why it was one of the biggest mistakes is because I've wasted, this is more practical than kind of philosophical. I wasted so much time and energy worrying about and tending to and fostering my plans. And they were all wrong. They were all irrelevant to where I ended up ultimately. There was so much mental energy and so much, just not only mental energy, but practical time that I did because I thought I needed to be at place X by certain dates. So therefore, be it a Supreme Court clerk or be a partner at Cleary or whatever the goal was, I spent so much time and energy worrying about trying to accomplish those goals. And it was all for naught. It was literally for naught because those goals ended up being entirely irrelevant to where I ended up. And actually, where my life and the most important aspects of my life were dictated and controlled by factors that were completely beyond my control. By fortuity, by timing, by other people's needs or the circumstances. Those are the things that determine, and they're all beyond my control. Those determine where I am eventually getting a job, who I married, who my key friends were, where I lived, and which countries I went to next. It had nothing to do, was not influenced in the least bit by all of the small things that I was worried about and that I spent my time and energy preoccupied with. It was for naught. And the reason was because I had these fixated plans of where I needed to be in order to be a success, quote unquote. So if I needed to be there by him, that means I have to do this. And by then I have to do that. And then by this stage, I have to do that. And so the next stage, I have to do that. And so I'd be trying to arrange my time and try to meet the right people to get to this place, to that place, and to go here and there and do that so that I can become there. And then it all for naught. So I just wasted so much time and energy trying to facilitate my plans. But in the end, probably 90+% of my life was dictated by things that were totally beyond my control. My plans, my thoughts about my plans, everything I did to facilitate my plans were just for naught. So that's the second reason that I think that not just making plans, but taking my plans so seriously is the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. And the one thing that I would change if I could do it all over again, or if I had known then, 40 years ago, what I know now, that is the one thing that I would change.
Well, that's very powerful sharing, Stanley. Thank you. And a very powerful message. It sounds like you were so fixated on, as you say, your plans and the future that you didn't focus on the present and the now and enjoy the journey. So something must have happened that made you realize all this. What was that thing that suddenly made you wake up and change your ways?
Getting older. Nothing more than that. I don't know, it's a slow process. Even nowadays, I less and less so. As I get older, I get less obsessed. I don't know, less preoccupied. As I get older, I get less preoccupied with where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to accomplish so it's just, I guess, just part of getting older, Lara, and not really anything more than that. I realize it's easier said than done. What I've advised is easier said than done. At times, I think it may just be part of the definition of being young. And how can you not help but be worried about your future when you're young? Because your whole life is ahead of you. And so I think it's the rare person indeed that can smell the roses along the way before they become old or older. Nevertheless, what I said still remains true. It is the one thing that I would change if I could. And if I knew then what I knew now, it is the one thing I would change.
What can young lawyers currently in the profession do to develop themselves, do you think?
I think in line with what I said about making plans, I think at a very practical level, you can't, I guess some people think when they look back on their careers that they could, but you can't really, how should I phrase this? I was going to say you can't really prepare for your career in a meaningfully specific sort of way. And I say that with a couple of things in mind. I'll try to explain what I think I would do if I were starting out my career. What would I do to prepare myself for my career? I'll tell you what my advice is in mind. But I'm saying you can't prepare for a career, meaningfully specific career, for two reasons. First, you never know what you're going to be doing. I thought when I started my career as a lawyer at a law firm, my goal, the purpose of my life, really, was to become a partner at a big law firm, big Wall Street law firm. And so I did the best preparation was go do some clerkships, put that on my CV, work really hard, build 2,500 hours a year, and get to ingratiate yourselves with all the key partners and work really hard, and do whatever it takes to really become a partner at Cleary, Gottlieb, or wherever. But I'm nowhere near a law firm now. And in fact, even if we're given the chance, I wouldn't want to be a partner at a law firm. That's not true for everybody, but I've been working at several different institutions. You never know what your job is going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and certainly 20 years from now, and certainly 30 years from now. So that's the first reason why I say that you can't prepare with meaningful specificity. The second reason you can't is because even if you could prepare for a career, even if you someone could lock yourself in and you could know that 10 years from now, you yourself would not change and that you would still want to be a law firm lawyer and you still would be in CDX and you still would have the chance to be a law firm lawyer, etc. Being a law firm lawyer will oftentimes require different sort of specialties or expertise. I don't know how many lawyers I've met who have started out specializing in one type of instrument, one area, and suddenly they find themselves irrelevant because the business has moved on, or because maybe the business has even stopped, or maybe that their clients or their firm have changed priorities, or so they spent their entire career thinking that, I've got to be an expert in securitization. At least they spent 3 or 4 years there specializing in, I've got to really buckle down. And at one point, it was quite in vogue for law firm associates to find a specialty. Oh, I've got to specialize in this area because that's the way to become a partner. You can't become a partner by being generalist. So I've got to pick one area and just specialize. And that's the way I'll become a partner. But suddenly the world moves on and they're stuck with a specialization that is no longer relevant or no longer the best specialization to be in or the most propitious one. And so they have to reinvent themselves. So that's the second reason. I mean, the world moves on, and even within a particular career, not only do you not know what you're going to do or what kind of career you're going to have, but even within your own career, your career changes. And third reason why you can't really specialize in any particular area is related to the first, because there's so many extraneous factors that will come to bear on what you do with your career. Even if we limit our discussion not just to your career, I mentioned a few of them in passing. Priorities of the place where you work at, be it a law firm or your company, priorities of your clients, the entire economy, pre-limit. There are all sorts of extraneous factors that will have a material bearing on what you do as a law firm lawyer, or certainly as a person. So my one advice is to lawyers is you can't really pick an area and just specialize in it, or at least you shouldn't take that specialization too seriously. I realize to some extent you may want to carve out a niche or whatever. But even if you do, you should be ready and flexible to move and adapt and adjust. So now what can you do? You'd ask me, what should a young lawyer do? Well, what they should do is dedicate and devote yourself to whatever you are doing at any given time with the best of intentions and effort and ability. So in sum, try your best. Try your best wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whoever you're with, whatever firm or whatever place you find yourself. Try your best to develop your fullest potential to the hilt. Why? There are two reasons why. First, you never know. You never know what, when, or whether or how those skills may be relevant to you in the future. Just devote yourself to whatever opportunities you have to the best of your ability. Just learn as much as you can, empower yourself as much as you can, and do as much as you can. The second reason why you should do that is because when you do work, you learn and you develop much more than just your technical kind of substantive knowledge that you glean from whatever project you're working on. You're not just learning about the intricacies of Reg S when you do a securities transaction or IP law, whatever it was. You're learning how to understand. You're gaining much more valuable general skills of working and analyzing legal documentation and communication and facilitation of transactions. And 90% of what you do and what you learn is probably totally unrelated to the specific content of what you're learning. It's just like going to school. When you go to school, you go to university, I don't remember a thing, almost nothing from my chemistry class in my freshman year at university. But I learned how to study. I learned how to take exams. I learned how to survive academically. Same thing as a lawyer. First piece of advice, just devote yourself as best as you can to whatever you're doing and just increase your abilities for those two reasons. Okay. One, you never know what's going to be relevant. And two, you're really developing a lot of other skills along the way. And then I guess the second piece of advice is for a young lawyer to try your best at whatever you're doing. And second, just be open, be aware, be open to opportunities that are all around you. This relates back to my mistake of being too fixated, being blinkered and focused on what I thought I needed to do at that time. And you never know what's going to happen or what opportunity is going to cross your path or where you're going to be or what's going to be important or what you will want to do later on. Just be open to everything going on around you as much as you can and to the opportunities that are there. And there will always be opportunities, always. Maybe not exactly the ones you want or you predicted or you expected, but there will always be opportunities for people who are proactive, who are energetic, who are positive, who apply themselves. You don't have to even be smart, but if you're a lawyer, you're probably smart to begin with. So that even adds to the opportunities that you have. The people be open and responsive. And then the last piece of advice I would give, or that I would change if I were going back, and this relates to the second point, it is be respectful and kind and to everybody you meet. Do not be judgmental. You never know. You never know who's going to become your friend or someone who can help you or someone who will be really valuable to you. Like you just absolutely never know. 60 years on, that's one. And that goes back to my my point about being too blinkered when I was going through all these experiences. You just never know. I should never have been presumptuous about knowing or about thinking that I know who I should spend time with or help or be open to or have relationships. Yeah, who I should spend time with. Just be open to everybody who comes across your path. Just be open to everybody and avoid being judgmental because no one knows. And I'm 60 years old and I have no clue about really what's going on. So that would be my last piece of advice. Try your best.
On that note, Stanley, I think you've shared some really powerful advice with young people, and I really appreciate your passion when you're sharing this, because as you say, you're nearly 60 and there's so much, insight and really heartfelt messages I feel that you're trying to give to young people. So thank you for coming on the show today, and thank you for all your wisdom.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Legal Genie podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give it a rating and review to help others find it. Please do subscribe so that you don't miss the next exciting episode of the Legal Genie podcast. Thanks for listening. Have a magical week ahead.